Last week, a single protest in the UK, which took all of a couple of seconds to execute, caught the attention of millions across the globe. I'm talking, of course, about Soupgate. This was so shocking because this is one of the most famous paintings in the world. Sunflowers by Van Gogh, or Van Gogh. Or maybe Van Gogh. Now, before we go on, it is important to mention that this painting was protected by glass and was not damaged. But of course, many of the people watching this, especially shortly after the event, wouldn't have known that. So today I, a climate scientist with a doctorate in atmospheric physics from the University of Oxford, want to break down what this group wants, how it fits into climate science, and what I think a lot of people are missing about these protests. This was carried out by young activists from the Just Stop Oil activist group, and it's just one of many disruptive actions that the group has taken. Perhaps most notably, they've also been blocking roads with demonstrators, much to the fury of motorists. So what does Just Stop Oil actually want? Well, the clue is in their name. Their demand is that the UK government makes a statement that it will immediately halt all future licensing and consents for the exploration, development and production of fossil fuels in the UK. I guess Just Stop Oil and Coal and Gas wasn't catchy enough. This demand comes in the context of the UK government offering over 100 oil and gas leases in the North Sea, while simultaneously making a push for fracking on land. So does Just Stop Oil's demand make sense? Well, here's what you need to understand about climate change. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more greenhouse gases there are in the atmosphere, and the hotter the world gets. That's because carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere like water filling up a glass. If we want to limit the amount the world warms, say to 2 degrees Celsius, then we have to limit the amount of carbon dioxide that we emit. In other words, we have to limit the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. Perhaps you can see where this is going. The limits we're generally talking about are 2 degrees, or ideally just 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. These might sound like random numbers, but they have real significance for the human and for the natural worlds. If we overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius, that could mean eliminating coral reefs and destruction of low-lying island nations due to sea level rise. Every fraction of a degree matters, and as global temperatures continue to climb to 2 degrees Celsius and beyond, we're looking at things like increased extreme weather, increased instability of the world's ice sheets, and increased areas of the globe made uninhabitably hot. And these targets are in the Paris Climate Agreement, which agrees to limit global warming to well under 2 degrees Celsius and ideally under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every country in the world is signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement, including the UK. Now, here's the problem. The world has already heated by over 1 degree Celsius. If we want to limit global warming to under 1.5 degrees, that means huge amounts of fossil fuels need to remain in the ground unburnt. We're talking 60% of oil and fossil gas and 90% of coal. In fact, the fossil fuel infrastructure that the world already has could on its own be enough to overshoot the 1.5 degree global warming target. So we need to be lowering emissions and shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure as quickly as possible. But by digging up new fossil fuels, the UK is talking about doing the exact opposite. In fact, these 100 oil and gas licenses could mean the UK overshooting its climate goals by a factor of 2. So I would say that the demand of Just Stop Oil makes scientific sense, though I have heard some call for an immediate end to burning fossil fuels, which, well, it would be physically possible, but let's just say there would be other challenges. Now, you might say, stopping fossil fuel use as quickly as possible isn't actually that quick. After all, there's an energy crisis thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I get this concern. There's a but coming, isn't there? There certainly is. But these licenses probably won't boost supply for years. And it's not like the UK government has exhausted all or even any of the other options for dealing with the energy crisis. I'm talking about things like mass insulation of buildings, better access to public transport, and even building the energy source that is actually cheapest, aka renewables, solar and wind. In fact, this government is finally reversing an effective ban on onshore wind, but at the same time is looking at putting in place an effective ban for solar in many contexts. It's very much 2 steps forward, 2 steps back with this government. So yeah, the idea that we have to dig up fossil fuels to deal with the energy crisis sounds like a lot of hot air. Now I know what you're going to say next. But the UK is just a tiny little island. Our emissions don't matter. And this ignores a pretty fundamental point, which is that the UK has emitted way more than its fair share. Remember that carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere. That means that it's the total emissions over history that actually matter. And looked at in this way, the UK is actually the world's 8th biggest historical emitter, despite just being a tiny island. So given all of this, I would say that Just Stop Oil's demand, namely that we end all exploration, development and production of fossil fuels, is pretty in line with what the science is telling us needs to be done, and is pretty in line with what would be fair considering the UK's historical emissions. But that's just their demands. What about their tactics? Now, I'm not here to tell you what to think about these tactics. In fact, I'd love to know what you think about the tactics. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. But one thing that I think everyone can agree on, including Just Stop Oil, is that the tactics are incredibly annoying. In fact, that's the whole point, to disrupt. And they definitely create a lot of strong and often negative feelings from people, including people who actively work on climate change. For example, some people feel that appearing to destroy art is the exact opposite of what we need to do in the face of climate change. Others think that it might alienate people from taking action themselves, or even alienate people from the very cause of climate change. And I don't know. But I do know this. What a lot of people overlook is that the goal isn't for people to like Just Stop Oil. The goal is for people to talk about and think about and act on climate change more, and for the issue of ending fossil fuel extraction to be raised in our consciousness. I remember a couple of years ago when Extinction Rebellion shut down roads across London for the very first time. I had a chat with a guy at the barber's, and he said to me, "Now look, of course we need to do something about climate change, but this Extinction Rebellion is going about it all wrong." And you know what? This was one of the first times I'd ever had a conversation with someone who wasn't a climate change nerd, and they'd started off by saying, "Of course we need to do something about climate change." Who are you talking to? So perhaps even if people are alienated by actions of groups like this, it still pushes them to engage in climate change like they never have before. And indeed, over the last few years, public concern about climate change has raised and policies are finally being passed. All of this is surely thanks, at least in part, to climate activism. But what do you think of these strategies? Do you think they disrupt too much and do more harm than good? Or perhaps you think they help us focus on climate change, something we urgently need to do, especially as our leaders are still shoving their heads and their oil drills in the ground. Perhaps you're even thinking about getting involved in Just Stop Oil's actions. Or maybe you even have a much better idea for how they should be protesting. I'd love you to share your perspective in the comments below. But as ever, please keep it kind and fact-based. But I'd also like to share something with you. Did you know that if the UK reaches net zero and the rest of the world doesn't bother, that would still be a win for the UK? Check out this video to find out why. Okay, until next time, bye. Ow.